Welcome to Series 3 of The Joy of Writing. I'm your host, Mark Carew, author of 3 novels, and someone who's interested in how other writers write, why they do it, and the fun or joy they get from their writing. You can leave feedback on any of the episodes at podchaser.com/The Joy of Writing. In this episode with Tom Benjamin, author of A Quiet Death in Italy, we learn how he was inspired by studying English literature at school, how he is wary of giving advice to other writers or joining writers' groups, and we hear more about Naples 44 as his inspirational book. So Tom, it's always interesting to hear from writers with book deals, published novels, published books, their own advice to someone brave enough to try and write a book, so an aspiring writer. And I know that you started your writing, and you've been writing forever, started writing with poetry. What was the attraction of that to you, and how did that develop?
That's a great question. I think I didn't really grow up in a very literary household, and so everything that I knew and learned about literature, books, either came from myself, random visits to the library, or from school, I guess. And thinking about it, because it's not something I've really thought about until you've asked me the question, I suspect I first turned to poetry because of our English literature O level. Mm-hmm. And because I started writing poetry when I was 15 or 16, and probably around 15 or 16 we started studying the war poets, and of course the war poets, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg. I mean, I don't know if they still study them. I guess they do.
They do indeed, yeah.
At that age, and their poetry was so incredibly accessible, and it wasn't your sort of Wordsworths, and there weren't too many sort of obscure poems, because of course the teachers were teaching kids, and so they wanted to try to make the poetry accessible. So I remember there was it Louis MacNeice's Ambulances, and a few other things as well outside, the war poetry genre. But I think that was probably how our teachers tried to first get us interested in poetry. And also they started talking to us about, obviously we had to do Shakespeare. And quite wisely our teacher selected Richard III, which is great. Mm-hmm. It just got loads of murder in it. And quite a lot of humour actually as well. And I remember our English teacher taking us to a matinee at the Royal Shakespeare, by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it was so I think that was how I probably first found literature accessible. And of course writing poetry, very Adrian Mole-like kind of poetry,
right. Yeah.
Is also pretty simple.
Mm.
You're trying to basically kind of, put your thoughts down on paper. You feel this sort of, desire to express yourself on paper, which comes from somewhere.
Mm.
As if you're an artist, a painter, you want to draw things. If you're a musician, you want to make a form of music. And if you're a writer, you want to write something. And so, in a sense, poetry is like a kind of gateway drug.
Yeah.
Because you kind of, you start writing your poetry and you start writing lines, and you start rhyming them or whatever. You're influenced by whoever you're reading, and it's okay. And it's actually because you had the war poets who are writing about bent double, we walked like beggars under sacks, trudging through the sludge while on the, to the sound of falling gas shells falling softly behind, and so on and so forth, from Dolce da Cordon Est. And I still remember it. Not, I still remember it actually better than that when I'm not on a podcast. It's okay. Soldiers are writing this stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's okay for a boy to write poetry.
Right. That's very interesting. That you're sort of given permission to write that type of thing, or because I mean, boys and reading, boys and writing, teenage boys, it don't normally go together. So I mean, would that advice be that if you feel the urge to write, then just write? You have permission to try.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that anyone can write, and I think probably the most important factor for any writer is the urge to write.
Yeah.
Because they say about almost everything, it's 9 parts effort and 1 part talent.
Yes, completely agree.
Yeah, and if you have a sufficient urge to write, then if you write enough and you try hard enough, then the chances are that you're going to produce something that is, acceptable to at least someone.
Yeah. So you've been writing for a fair few years now, and I know you're working on book 3.
Yeah.
I mean, in all of that time, and obviously you have the impulse to write, and you obviously enjoy it, but how do you actually in your day physically get down to the business of moving your next novel ahead and writing the next thing?
I will tell you.
You can reveal your secrets.
But yeah, I'm a bit wary of writerly advice, ways of doing things. This is the trick. This is the trick. This is the way you do it, because everyone is different.
Yes.
And one size does not fit all. I can obviously offer advice, and much of it will be advice that I never took. For example, I think that it's probably a great idea for people to join writers' groups. I joined one, but that's because I'm shy. That's because I would be embarrassed to I would have been embarrassed to share my stuff with other writers. I'm just not that sort of person. But many of the debut authors in a group that I belong to, we don't share our writing, but we're published authors, so we discuss the business and so on.
Yeah.
They all got a huge start from belonging to writers groups. For me, basically, if I don't write in the morning, then that's it. That's my most creative time, and pretty much if I get distracted by something, like yesterday we were talking about, yesterday I had this trauma with some people who had come into our building, were trying to fit the wrong windows, and I was arguing with them and blah blah blah, and then it was 10:30 and I tried to sit down and do some writing and it had gone.
Yeah.
Because I need to sort of get up. I can have a shower and all the rest, but then I need to sit down and write, because that's between 9 and about 1. That's my really creative time. In the afternoon I can do some editing and so on and so forth, but that's pretty much it for me.
Yeah. The important thing there, I mean, I completely agree, there is no one size fits all, but there's sort of this general notion that writing is so much about discovery, about discovering how you're going to write and what your daily routine would like to be, for example. And also discovering about what you're going to write, because you might start with absolutely the smallest clue as to what it'll be a feeling, an impulse, a scene, a dream, whatever, and you'll grow it from there. And also with writing, as we've heard many times before from writers, reading is so important. And you mentioned last time a very influential book, Naples 44. Would you like to describe sort of that impact and how it influenced you?
Well, basically, Naples 44 is a true account by the writer, the great British writer Norman Lewis, who was both a novelist and an essayist. of his time working as an intelligence officer in Naples in 1944, which had just been liberated by the Allies. And it's essentially his diary. And I had a look at it just before this programme, and I was interested to note that although he had written tons of novels and sort of travel books from about 1951, this actually wasn't published until 1978.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, he kind of sat on it for a while, and I'm not sure why. I think it probably would have been impossible to have published it any earlier, before he had actually made his name, and because actually it's pretty eye-opening as well as being beautifully written. It's factual, but it reads essentially like a novel.
Mm-hmm.
I took a look, as I said, and there are just sort of scenes here. I mean, every page is full of scenes. If I just read this, he's arrived in Italy. They've landed. The Allies have landed, and they're in the process of liberating the place. And he says, the peace of this place after four days of the racket of warfare was stunning. 2 aged women in black gossiped into each other's ears, and a white bearded old man, a kind of Italian Father Christmas, spoiled by a crinkling obsequious smile, sat at a table by his garden gate selling wine. It was immediately clear that the local belief was that the Germans had gone, never to return, because as soon as he spotted me, he held up a notice, Vino gli Aliati. That means wine for the Allies. I pulled up, bought a glass of wine, which looked and tasted like ink, and asked him whether there were Germans about, and he put on a hideous smirk. He got up and beckoned to me to follow him into his cottage, where a uniformed man was sprawled, head on his chest, in a deep chair. This was the first German I had seen, and he was dead. Speaking in some local dialect, quite inaccessible to me, the old man tried to explain what had happened. He was clearly accepting responsibility for the German's death, and expected praise and perhaps even a reward. His gestures seemed to claim that he had put poison in the soldiers' wine. I couldn't decide whether or not this was a piece of sycophantic bluff. I pushed him aside and went out. A disgusting old fellow, but a reliable barometer, I suspected, of the Germans' prospects in this particular theatre of war.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, the guy writes with such kind of, clarity.
Yeah.
And it's that he writes a bit, of that era, of the era of, George Orwell, with that kind of clipped English tone. A bit. It reminds me a bit of Homage to Catalonia, Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. There are two things here. After we moved to Italy, in order to learn the language, I got a job working in a homeless canteen.
Yes, you mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah, and there, I experienced a different kind of Italy, and I came across a lot of criminality and this, that, and the other, and that got me beginning to think about trying to depict this other Italy. And then I came across this book by Norman Lewis. I thought, well, here's my way in.
Yeah.
Here is this, British secret policeman or what have you, working his way, as it says on the cover of the book, through the Italian labyrinth. And, that was very much how Italy felt for me. So in a sense, people say to me, well, is Daniel Lester you? Actually, Daniel Lester is probably a bit more like Norman Lewis, transported to modern day Bologna, and that was the sort of kind of impression that I was trying to get. I mean, coming back to the book, the account is really quite outstanding, and there are so many memorable scenes. There are these kind of scenes of absurdity, but this kind of like grotesque absurdity, like for example that scene that I just read out, and it kind of reads, sometimes it kind of reads like Evelyn Waugh, but other times there's the kind of real grim reality of war that kind of upsets your expectations, and that also sort of appealed to me. Shortly after that scene, there's another scene that has always left an impression on me, which I'll just kind of quickly read out, because you have this idea of the British and the Americans as the liberating heroes, and a few days later, Lewis writes, at the British headquarters, "Here I saw an ugly sight. A British officer interrogating an Italian civilian and repeatedly hitting him about the head with a chair. Treatment which the Italian, his face a mask of blood, suffered with stoicism. At the end of the interrogation, which had not been considered successful, the officer called in a private of the Hampshires and asked him in a pleasant, conversational sort of manner, 'Would you like to take this man away and shoot him?' The private's reply was to spit on his hands and say, 'I don't mind if I do, sir.' The most revolting episode I have seen since joining the forces."
Yeah.
I mean, that's not the sort of thing that you read about the, British liberating Italy.
No, right. There's not the usual standard heroes and everything's a triumph. I think I can see where you're coming from much more clearly, because in your book, quite definitely, you take a very sort of investigative reporter role. And you've said before that you're not biased one way or the other with how Italy is, and as you're writing as an outsider. And I can see with the war poetry that interested you as a young boy. I think you're after the truth of the matter, really. In a situation where there is so much going on and it's so much gloss over, with all the heroism and that type of thing. And it leads me on just to ask you very quickly about another book you did mention before this, which was about UN peacekeeping missions, in a book called We Did Nothing. And again, this is lifting the lid and getting under the skin of the situation. And you have a background in international aid and as a reporter, so I can sort of see where all these influences are coming from. You really want to see how the thing ticks, how the country works, that type of thing. Would I be right in that, or is that just my own impression?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as a writer, and I think that all writers, I would presume that most writers are searching for a kind of truth.
Yeah.
Certainly, in everything that I've written, that has been, I think, that has sort of underlain it. I remember that, from quite a selfish perspective, I was working with the police, and then I decided to, I became interested in international development. But it sounds as if I'm, a kind of do-gooder. And obviously I wanted to do well. I mean, I wanted to do kind of well by people, and I wanted to help people. But I considered myself as a writer, and there was also an element of just being really fascinated in other worlds, other cultures, and other experiences. And certainly, from a selfish perspective, although I like and I hope that I did, some good in the decade that I spent working in international development, it certainly also informed my perspective as a writer. I suppose my scene, which is rather less dramatic than the scene that Lewis wrote there, would be when I was in Kosovo, and I remember the scene that's never sort of left me was when we were sort of delivering aid right after Kosovo had been liberated. Rather in the process of it being liberated, because we had kind of gone in with the British Army. And I remember, being in this truck, and there's tons of, traffic in Pristina, the capital, as people were panicking, basically just trying to get out. And had like the Serbian security forces sort of, everywhere, and trying to like pack up stuff and burning buildings and all the rest. Anyway, the point is that I remember we kind of got stuck in this traffic jam, and I saw this, and there was this, and this traffic jam was full of refugees, Kosovan Serbian refugees, and I remember seeing this woman standing outside her car, and the kids were in the car, and they were kind of, they're pressing their faces against the window, and they were kind of looking, in the other direction. So I kind of looked in the other direction, and I could see the KLA, I think the Albanians literally coming over the hill, running down the hill toward this kind of, refugee convoy of Serbs, and, with, their machine guns at the ready, and then, vroom, we were off. And, because it was dangerous and there's lots of stuff going on, as you can imagine. But I never forgot that scene, because, we were supposed to be the liberators, and it was something that was kind of, massively kind of, celebrated everywhere. Oh, we've kicked out the evil Serbs. But, I'll never forget the look of, terror on those kids' faces.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I'm sure, I don't know what happened. But, being an observer, and and seeing the sort of contradictions inherent in that sort of role. So an understanding that the truth, is often more complicated than it may actually be portrayed to be. Yeah. And there, even when you're winning, there are always losers, and those losers may be perfectly innocent individuals. Yeah. And that is something that sort of fascinates me as a writer, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's very, very interesting to learn about. Your background and your approach and your experiences that have all added up to sort of influence your writing. I must say, for quite definitely, I thought was. I'm no expert on crime fiction at all, but I thought it was much more than crime fiction, to be honest. And I think I enjoyed it for that, and I did like the way you got under the hood of Bologna and Italian society, and yeah, it was a very, very interesting read, and very interesting to hear about how you work, and how others hopefully will find some of that inspirational. Draw on your own experiences and your own desires, and have a go, or keep going if you're already halfway there.
I would say that's the thing. Keep going.
Keep going, absolutely. Thank you, Tom. My thanks to Tom Benjamin and all the other writers who have appeared on the podcast so far. Please check out the episode notes for details of their books. Please also leave your feedback at podchaser.com/The Joy of Writing. Until the next time, keep well, keep reading, and keep writing if that's your thing.